All right, first of all, thank you, Benjamin, for such a nice introduction. And I want to say special thanks to Francisco Rodriguez for inviting me to come to this incredibly prestigious and very admired program for that I feel very fond of. I used to work at SOM Chicago, and half the office went to the school. So congratulations for running such a wonderful program here. You know, very glad to be in person somewhere after 2 years of pandemic and a year of maternity leave. It's great to be back in space with many people and having such great discussions. I look forward to such a great lecture series, and I'm very honored to be part of that lineup, and I will be watching the rest of them via Zoom next time. Okay, let's get started. So the title of my lecture is the architecture as infrastructure. And can I check? Can you hear me in the back? Okay, good. Architecture as infrastructure, designing the intersection of planetary health and human health. If I can indulge in a moment of self-reflection, I have to say that I'm very grateful to be here, because in giving these lectures always makes you to where you did, and it was a really helpful process preparing for this lecture, as I sort of come at a very particular point in my trajectory that I find is a good time to reflect. I want to share some notes on my trajectory and motivations, because I think as students, you are in the beginning of a trajectory. And I always like to think about how we construct arguments and how we're spending our profession, our professional career, really continuing to explore certain themes. And you might find that in your, that might happen in your future. So these motivations are what I call creative anxieties. I have managed through a constant dialogue between practice and research. I have been very fortunate to have practiced for 17 years now, and that includes a substantial amount of built work, both new and renovated, as well as exhibitions, prototypes, landscape installations, and environmental strategies. So I'm a researcher who really is embedded in practice. I also have been teaching and researching for 10 years in a more official job where I conduct research. And I have been testing ideas and scholarship through articles, exhibit catalogs, books, all of which examine, reflect on, and challenge the way we think about practice. And this dialogue between between research and practice really started with my graduate thesis. At the University of Michigan, I combined a traditional historical research-based thesis for the urban planning degree that I was completing with a design-based thesis for my architecture degree. And that thesis was primarily focused on the concept of ecological fragmentation as a lens to analyze the landscape of Detroit. It really reflected my preoccupation with the condition that human development was creating in the landscape and its impacts on humans and other living species. And mind you, this was 21 years ago. And you know, we still had time to fix the climate change issue. So we were still worried about, you know, how we're gonna do this, how we're gonna fix this damage that we created. I found that design, especially civil and landscape architecture, offered some infrastructural solutions for this issue of fragmentation to mitigate the effects of fragmentation. Ecological corridors come to mind. But in the human development and the human environment, we were a little bit less kind. Infrastructure dominates rather than just separating or healing. It operates at a scale that homogenizes people based on economic and political models that marginalize some by assuming that everyone has the same opportunity for mobility. And what results is not only ecological degradation from too much impervious surface and not enough green space, but also a misalignment between populations, parts of the population, and the richness of resources that we can have in metropolitan areas, in natural environments, etc. So basically a deep inequality. And that really had been an interest of mine since then. So rather than working at an urban scale, when I graduated, I sought to work in projects that tried to repair this fragmented world at a human scale, that restored the connection and the continuity of the landscape by thinking of architecture as a constructed landscape. After a 2-year stint at SOM Chicago, which was very formative, 2 very intense years, working mostly in the Middle East and Asia, I moved to Boston to work with my very good friend and mentor, Marianne Thompson, who is also trained as a landscape architect and is running a very successful woman-owned architecture firm that has now built hundreds of projects throughout mostly New England and the Northeast. These are some of the projects that I worked on in that office that I was leading or collaborating with some of my closest coworkers there. And to my great satisfaction, I saw and supervised many of these projects getting built. And what they all had in common was an effort to not only be very sustainable, especially in terms of incorporating passive systems for that were immersing people in natural experiences by heightening the natural phenomena in everyday life. And the typology that caught my attention the most from all that work was schools, especially schools for young children. Our work was very driven by research, evidence-based design strategies that looked at how sustainability actually could also mitigate the vulnerabilities that children have to the built environment, and to leverage the potential for architecture to support their healthy development through exploration, through to cultivate creativity, curiosity, environmental stewardship, love for learning, etc. This project at Princeton University was my last one at MTA. It was completed in 2017. And it became my own professional thesis, if I can call it that. It was a higher education client that had never built this type of typology before. It was intended to be for children of faculty and students there. So it involved collaborating with many researchers in early child development, with educators, with parents, with user groups, and working very closely with Michael van Valkenburg landscape architects to integrate the building and the landscape into a continuous sequence of natural play, but also to advance the goals of the campus plan. Princeton had ongoing efforts to do ecological woodland restoration through each architectural project, and to build capacity of the campus in their green infrastructure for stormwater. So each project contributed to that. The building and the landscape were not only beautifully connected as a spatial sequence for people, for water, for animals, but also they were an integrated whole. And it transformed a degraded greenfield site into a rich ecosystem for people and other species. But I couldn't help but wonder after those 11 years, how the lessons that were applied in these projects that were so well endowed could translate to environments and populations that have less resources. And I went searching again for ways to interrogate how to mobilize that knowledge that exists within our profession of very thoughtful and talented professionals, and leverage that to solve bigger societal problems. And this is where getting into teaching as a research faculty gave me a new space to ask these questions. I became interested in how the paradigm of designing spaces for children so that they learn through exploration would be possible in urban environments, especially when so much of it was formed on natural play. And when we think about the global situation, most populations are migrating to very urban areas that have less green space and more inequality. So after the Princeton project, I ran a 2-semester master research studio focused on this idea of if in the city, the child explores the entire landscape, and therefore we should design every space in the city for learning and thinking about it as a constructed landscape. The framework that emerged with our students really was an interesting exploration developed with a transdisciplinary team of experts, from neuroscientists to child's rights experts and pedagogy experts, to develop a set of principles to design cities that are more playful, safer, more green, more inclusive, and healthier. The projects range from coastal protection that integrated active spaces for families, streets transformed into green cultural corridors that express the diversity of Boston children, to biophilic living communities that constructed new housing immersed in constructed landscapes. So this is really what propels my research, to work in transdisciplinary ways to generate knowledge about working with natural ecosystems and with real communities. I do systemic analysis of design practice through case studies, interviews, analytical drawings, mappings, and design projects. And I engage with communities most vulnerable to climate change through participatory research to co-develop new visions of how design can better serve them. And I'm working on the premise that our past and current approaches to building are completely inadequate. So we need a new paradigm. In essence, we need a theory for building that is grounded in the real world and that guides us to build new urban ecologies that are more sustainable and more equitable, and to generate a robust discourse within our profession about where to build, what to build with, and who to build for. This has also given me the benefit or the privilege of starting my own practice with my partner and husband, where we've been exploring some of the applications of this research to projects that have, let's say, lower budgets. We work with clients that have an interest in exploring interesting ideas and trying to do it in ways that use better, that are more efficient with resources. So that includes what we call less unaffordable housing in Boston. I think affordable housing is really not a thing, unfortunately. We've done urban retrofits, and what has become a favorite of mine, transforming suburban typologies to be more sustainable and connected to the landscape, as well as what I call institutional stewardship. So that's where we work with institutions like museums or nonprofit groups to do the hard work of master planning and executing the slow renovation of older but significant buildings, one little project at a time. And then speculative projects where we do competitions, prototypes, installations that explore some new idea about better connecting with the urban landscape. So with that intro, I will dive into the meat of the lecture, which is divided into two related parts. In each of them, I will introduce to you what I see as a global dynamic that is changing in response to climate change. And then I will show you how some of the design research and methods we're using to examine how architecture can have agency in mitigating and adapting to these new situations. So I'll start with ecology, and I want to pause to say that the term ecological is thought of usually as anything that is inherently good, but I want to clarify that what I mean by that is really working with an understanding of relationships in complex systems. Ecology, has also disruptive patterns to it. So here's the big global dynamic that's changing. Obviously, we have a warming climate, and the mitigation of that problem is an ecological problem. We have to keep the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, so 19th centuries, think whatever the temperature was there, to avoid the most devastating consequences of climate change. It has already risen about a degree, and so we have about a half a degree left before things get really, really hard, and we have to mitigate really fast because we are running out of time. Now, you know the story. Buildings account for 20% of the energy used in the world. In the US, it's 40%, 70% of its electricity. It's projected to grow about 2% per year. And of course, we are building a lot more buildings. It used to be that each individual building used to spend a lot more. We've done a good job of reducing what each individual building uses. But the reason the growth is not exponentially higher is really because we are seeing the grid get greener. We are expecting the grid to get a little greener over time. But this is a lot, and this is only operational energy. The moment a building is you open the doors for the first time, you've already spent a lot of energy just building that building. How much energy goes into building buildings is something that is quite large, and until recently, we were not paying much attention to this. And the critical thing, and the reason why I talk about this in the context of time, is that we spend that energy immediately, right away, right? Those emissions are already in the atmosphere. Whereas operational energy is used over many years. So the savings you achieve with certain strategies, you will only materialize them over many years. So if we want to make a big impact now, we have to think about embodied energy. And there are many, ways to think about buildings, but when you think about what the definition of infrastructure is, an underlying framework, an organizational and physical system, supports basic functions, provides a common culture, a common good. I want you to look at this photograph and see the amount of space occupied by buildings. It is the underlying framework of cities. It is the physical and organizational system, and it provides many common forms of common good. Now, those are all existing buildings. Some of them have been there for over 100 years, and the carbon used to build them was already spent. It's already in the atmosphere. So we should be thinking about using them for as long as possible, because presumably that would reduce the carbon emissions that each subsequent generation will have to spend in building the buildings they need. But that is only possible if buildings last. So how do we design architecture as a resilient infrastructure that sustains our culture for a very long time and supports the changes that come with different generations while minimizing waste? And I post the argument I make is that structure has a lot to do with that. Structure relies on principles of robustness and redundancy, and those are the very principles of resilience. And so as an infrastructure for adaptation, the structure of buildings really becomes critical in how we design for less carbon use over time. Now, this question was the motivation for our proposal for the 2017 Latrobe Prize, which was the AI College of Fellows had focused in 2017 in the adaptive reuse and regenerative buildings. My colleagues, David Fannon and Peter Witherspoon, and I put together a proposal that we were fortunate to win, and it funded 3 years of research, well, 2 years, and then we continued working for another year that ended in a project, a book project called The Architecture of Persistence, and that was published last year. This theory is rooted in the idea that architects can create and support material ecologies and economies of resistance and long-lasting value that in itself challenges current material practices of waste. In one of the chapters I wrote, I argued, this is a chapter called Material Ecologies, I argued for an approach that creates abundance and diversity as a means to longevity. And I mean this as a little bit of a critique of sustainability, because we often focus so much on operational energy that we do the same thing we do when we design buildings too precisely for a program. That is that we focus on optimizing so much, and we can cause the premature failure of that building before the end of life of its materials, simply because of obsolescence. So I argued that we need to place the most capacity, the most diversity, the most abundance, generosity into the slowest changing elements of architecture, those that can provide a productive resistance by anchoring architecture in its cultural and ecological landscape. And that to me is the structure and site. This is not a new argument. Stuart Brown did sort of make this argument about the site and the structure being the two most lasting elements, because they ground architecture in a place to give it the kind of continuity and specificity that makes architecture worth keeping. Structural systems and structural patterns give form and connect to the land and shape the continuity of the public realm with the building, within the building. They are the infrastructure of buildings and therefore the infrastructure of cities. Now, the ideas we explored, this idea of structure, we explored in an exhibition called Durable, which was shedding light into the role of durability as a measure of sustainability. And when we say sustainability, we're thinking cultural, physical, and environmental longevity. This exhibit tried to answer the question, what to build with. It curated analytical drawings, models, and data on 4 case studies, each representing a primary structural material. We chose these buildings explicitly designed for a long life, although each in different ways, one in concrete, one in steel, one in timber, one in masonry. Each of them pushed the limits of their respective materials in some particular way. And most importantly, each of them were a very didactic building. They had a lot to teach us. As part of the ecologies part of the exhibition, we considered the embodied carbon of these buildings. So we're thinking about that as it's the equivalent of the contribution to climate change or greenhouse gas emissions. The analysis only included the materials and construction, so not operating the building, just what you spend on just building the building before you turn the lights on. And what you see, the bar on the left is the embodied energy of what we would call an average baseline building. What we build in the US in average is about 300 kilograms of carbon equivalents per meter square. And we normalize by area per meter square so we can compare one building to another. You can see that the very, oh, and I should mention that it's hard to see the different hatches, but we have different systems here, and you can see if you get closer, and this is published in an article if you want to see it closer. Structure is one of the biggest contributors to that initial investment in carbon. And so you can see that the very durable steel building has much higher embodied carbon. The concrete building even higher, and the masonry building even higher. So it is a big investment on carbon to make durable buildings, no doubt. The wood building looks good compared to the baseline, assuming that it's sustainably harvested wood. But then these buildings start living. So you have the lifespan of the building in there, and you start to change materials, make replacements, replace enclosures and other components, and you start to add some of these. And what you see is that if you tear the baseline building down, the black one, every 50 years, which is more or less how long our buildings supposedly last, our contemporary buildings, now you're having to rebuild it again. And you can see how that replacement of buildings every 50 years gets off the chart pretty quickly. Whereas the durable buildings, even when you're adding significant amounts of the curtain wall in the case of the courthouse building, start to actually level off. And what's interesting is that they start very different at the beginning, but after 70 or 80 years, the embodied carbon of each of them is actually very close. So durability does matter, because that means that making the materials work, making the spaces welcoming and capable of changing use, having a certain generosity of them and a humanity to them. Thinking about functionality and human experience as much as durability and energy use means that the building will serve many generations, and it amortizes that amount of initial carbon investment over a long time. If the building becomes obsolete, it doesn't matter what it's made of, it will be torn down. And so that's really important to think about. So if they are not that different in the long term, then how do we decide what to build with? Well, one thing is, and this is something that emerged out of our research, we need to think about the affordances that are provided by the elements that have to stay there forever. Each of these buildings exemplify 4 concepts. I call them resist, capture, temper, and exchange. You can learn more about these buildings in our writing, which describe how these materials were selected to create long-lasting connections to a specific place, to the local economy, to the renewable resources of the region, to the microclimate, to what one of these architects called the patrimony. It's an idea about heritage or an endowment, some ability afforded to the space by the earth. I kind of always thought maybe it should be matrimony, it's Mother Earth, but it's a different term. So it does get into this very fundamental idea of integration, something that has more than one function, and in this case, some very fundamental functions integrated into these long-lasting components. But of course, because we are in a hurry, because climate change, we have to mitigate quickly, we try to extract some lessons from that. Okay, maybe we should try to not build so many new buildings. That would be a good place to start. And if you do have to build a new building, use low carbon materials, perhaps wood, if it can be sustainably harvested and sustainably and fairly harvested. But that's probably an overgeneralization. The larger point here is that persistence is place specific. It is connected to what Dolores Hayden called the power of place. The idea that landscapes are an important framework for public memory, for the preservation of cultural heritage, and because it represents a form of shared time and a shared territory. And yet, when you read any theory about adaptation of buildings over time, about transformation and change in architecture, landscape or site design are seldomly the focus of any of those theories. We focus too much on the objects of architecture, and we need to think about first the ecology of and the place within which this building will have to connect and transform. This brings me to the second idea of equity, thinking about architecture as an agent for public health. Now, the effects of climate change vary significantly from one place to another. People's own special circumstances can make the effects of climate change that more intense. But what is true everywhere is that people occupy buildings for a very long time. And so for better or for worse, people's own longevity is tied to the health of the planet and the health of the spaces we build. To frame this issue, let me start with one of the biggest impacts of climate change on planetary health, and that is obviously the melting of the glaciers. Naturally, we expect that much more water to be circulating, and we expect that water to be warmer. We can all understand sea level rise as a result of that. And we can sort of understand how that creates more storms. It's kind of a complicated thing, but there are more complex changes that are less obvious and that will require attention to the specific social context in which these occur. One of these examples of these dynamics is groundwater. Theoretically, some of that extra moisture coming out of the glaciers in the air could be stored below grade, especially in dry areas, which could potentially slow down sea level rise. The irony, though, is that much of the additional water is causing more frequent and intense rains in the parts of the world that are already very humid and that already have high groundwater. On the other hand, dry areas are seeing more severe droughts and have to extract more groundwater for irrigation, which increases the evaporation of water into that area and then downwind precipitation. So basically, dry areas get drier, wet areas get wetter. The dry areas are depleting aquifers and transferring that groundwater to wet areas. And this is happening at the same time that sea levels are rising and aquifers are becoming contaminated and entire ecosystems are changing as a result. So the big takeaway is that climate change seems to exacerbate existing inequality and making the extremes worse. These differences in climate impacts are also exacerbated by differences in social vulnerabilities. This very recent report by the United Nations explains how climate change disproportionately impacts the global regions with the most vulnerable populations, especially populations of color in the global south. And even though the US as a whole is being shown as a seemingly wealthy nation with overall medium to low social vulnerability, it points out that significant threats to urban ethnic minorities are driven by our deep inequality, which affects the oldest and densest coastal cities, mostly in the northeastern United States. And these global shifts have very interesting architectural implications that are both technical as well as aesthetic. And I examined those in one of my articles in the Journal of Architectural Education, as I was interested in this because I found it perplexing that many contracts for architects end the responsibility of the architect 5 feet outside of the building. And from that point on, it's civil or landscape that deals with it. Our job is to shed water away from the building. But we won't get away with just shedding water for much longer. We will need to be increasingly creative to work with water within architecture projects. So I wrote about how places like Venice is not only necessary to adapt the idea of ground, as Carlos Carpa did so beautifully in the Fundación Ecorenista Ampalia, which is maybe 60s or 70s, to manage the recurrent influx of water in what is known as the agua alta, right? The big increases in the surface water, right? But the existence of most of Venice is tied to what happens below grade, because Venice underground is also a forest of millions of wood piles that are supporting buildings that have become an entire ecosystem. And scientists are monitoring the changes in the flora of microorganisms living in that wood for signs of changes in the lagoon caused by sea level rise. Some of those changes could result in the kind of ecosystem that eats at those piles and could actually be what destroys Venice, as opposed to the rising water. In Rotterdam, the sea level rise is not the biggest concern for the Dutch, who have mastered this relationship for centuries. It's what they call cloudbursts, when storms come and drop way too much rain in a small amount of time, and there is not enough time for the storm drain system to absorb that, and it floods. The city estimated that based on the projections for rain in the future, they need the capacity of at least 160 million gallons of water storage, or what they describe essentially as building a 200-acre lake underground. And for representational purposes, I made a 200-acre lake of a circle in the aerial photograph of Rotterdam. But most of that, as you see, is buildings and impervious surface. So not exactly conducive to storing groundwater, water. Now, the firm de Urbanistain came up with the concept of the water square, a floodable recreational space in the center of blocks that floods spectacularly through channels and waterfalls when the underground storage overflows. And it gives it time, I think a maximum of 72 hours, to sit there while it infiltrates below grade or evaporates or feeds plants, and then leaves the rest for the storm drain to handle later when the load has gone down. This very architectural solution, which they call buffering rains, is now the central concept for Rotterdam's climate adaptation plan. But the idea of infiltrating water into the ground does not work everywhere, as we can see in London, which has a fascinating groundwater history. A shallow and a very deep aquifer, as seen in the section I drew here, it's a section of the Serpentine Pavilion by Herzog and de Meuron and Ai Weiwei. That section, they excavated the building down to the depth of the shallow aquifer and built the roof, which now is at eye level for people, as a reflecting pool of rainwater that came down into the water hole in the center of the architectural space to recharge the aquifer. And that is a really beautiful way of thinking about, telling the story of holding and buffering water. The issue, though, is that the project does not express that for hundreds of years, Londoners drew down the deep aquifers by pumping groundwater by hundreds of feet. And as you can see in the timeline in this section, when they moved to piped water supply and abandoned those wells, the groundwater has been coming back up with a vengeance. And because the city has built basements down below the shallow aquifer, in so deep and extensively, there is nowhere for water to go into the ground on the shallow aquifer except under roads. Now, with increasing rain projections and sea level rise, the groundwater is threatening the city from underneath by swelling the London clay. So London is continuously pumping groundwater at the pace of 70 million liters per day, just to keep things stable. And this can only get worse. In contrast, the city of Boston exists between two threads: excess surface water from storm surge and dropping groundwater levels from not having enough infiltration due to impervious surface. And not just that, drawdown from leaky pipes and leaky basements, etc. And this is actually threatening the historic fabric of buildings that, like Venice, is built on wood piles that are deteriorating when exposed to the air underground, because they're supposed to remain submerged in order to not rot, basically. And these historic areas are built in fill on low-lying areas. So you can see the old Boston original land, and the gray is the fill. All of that fill is essentially wood piles that are potentially deteriorating. Now the city has over 900 monitoring wells across a very small district, and they measure the groundwater about quarterly, as fast as they can, because they have one person doing this manually all day long. What is interesting is that in contrast to London, Boston is injecting 70,000 gallons of potable water, so about 4 times the amount of water that London is extracting per day into the ground of residential areas near the major train station, because it's easier than fixing the leaks in the train station that are drawing down the groundwater. And this is all to avoid a lawsuit from building owners if their very expensive real estate sinks into the ground. So these projects show that the effects of climate change are not uniform and indeed are very context specific, and that most of the time they're not very visible. Unlike the very dramatic and more obvious failure of infrastructure, this happens because most infrastructure is centralized and hierarchical. There is no redundancy. One central part fails, everything connected to it fails. That is the result of the systems designed with the belief that we could outsmart nature and overconfidence in our ability to do big things like with technology, like stopping the ocean. Now, recently, green infrastructure has emerged as a solution that works with natural systems. Not recently, but it's becoming more talked about. It's leveraging their capacity of natural systems, creating more redundancy in each site, whether by generating your own electricity or managing stormwater within each site, et cetera. It lends itself to incremental changes that match more closely the architectural scale, which means that they can better integrate into and enhance the local context of social and ecological systems at a human scale. In urban environments, this paradigm is not one of self-reliance, but one of cooperation. It's not the building as a island, but one that contributes to a more resilient landscape, because it creates a more distributed network of green nodes, more redundancy than a big centralized solution, and these hyper-productive living systems can grow to become a network. And there's an opportunity for continuing innovation in vertical densification of ground surfaces within the architectural volume to increase the inherently limited capacity of the urban landscape. Now, there are many ambitious projects that are doing this really well. Building and green infrastructure, very well integrated to do both mitigation and adaptation. They rely on living systems, which are renewable, resilient, and provide many co-benefits for people in those buildings and around the buildings. But these are exceptional projects. And if we are serious about equity, we need to do more of this in the places that matter most, and we need to measure impacts beyond site boundaries. But to do this, we as architects need to better understand the ecological and social context in which we're building. And we need to embrace science and technology to measure and to engage the most affected communities in visualizing these impacts and envisioning an alternative future. This is integrating the social, the technical, and the ecological. I was interested in knowing if this would work, and I found an opportunity to experiment in Boston. Since 2007, the city of Boston used the zoning ordinance to require that architectural projects of more than 50 square feet have to install groundwater recharge stations. That's what you see on the left here. It's basically a big concrete thing filled with rocks that holds groundwater, holds stormwater for a little bit, and then it gives it time to infiltrate. It needs to store and infiltrate the first 1 inch of water that falls on a site, which is actually is quite a bit. So I got very interested in mapping these, because through those first 10 years, and now maybe 15, close to 400 recharge stations have been installed, primarily in backyards. The most common size of a brownstone in these areas is 200 cubic feet of water storage, which, according to a model developed by engineers at Tufts University, each of these can increase the groundwater by as much as a foot in areas immediately adjacent to a recharge structure. So I saw great potential to understand the cumulative effect of a network of small interventions within the context of architecture projects. But what also intrigued me about the dynamics of stormwater is how little legibility it has until it overwhelms. It's a famous, these are all over Boston. Don't jump, drains to the Charles River. That's the closest you get to understanding, oh, what I put in here is actually going to go down to a larger ecosystem. So I did 2 things. I developed ways to make those recharge stations more visible in public space. by designing an object of urban furniture that marks the location of the underground dry wells and integrates groundwater sensors and lights that communicate real-time information about an otherwise invisible process. And the second, I transformed the monitoring wells, which exist in the sidewalks, into interactive and luminous objects on the sidewalk, using sensors and Bluetooth to engage the public with real-time information about ecological systems. And that would show up in an app that we designed for crowdsourcing the data, where citizen scientists could be engaged in the process of collecting and uploading that data, facilitating doing that process much longer than the one guy doing it manually around the city. So we worked with the Boston Groundwater Trust, and we proved this concept. We had it installed for a few months. It was really great. Now, the good thing about experimenting this way, didn't change the world, but eventually other people with very cool and related ideas reach out to you and say, hey, do you want to work together on something? And that's how we came to form that team that responded to the call for the proposals for the 22 Latrobe Prize. The theme was the intersection of two problems: the scale of our planetary health problems being enormous, but the solutions having to be built locally to create more equitable outcomes, and that we should try to understand how architecture and design can contribute to outcomes that go beyond the individual users of the building, that it should be understood as more interconnected paradigm of cooperation and generosity. The proposal was called Common Senses. It's a play on sensor networks and the idea of the commons. We have 4 faculty team members from different fields: architecture, Dan O'Brien from urban informatics, Amy Mueller, an engineer that designs environmental sensors, and Moira Sellner, who's an expert in participatory modeling and is developing tools for that. And our most important partner in the research is the city of Chelsea. We're working with this community that exemplifies how buildings are at the intersection of planetary and human health. Chelsea's landscape, which is just outside of Boston, embodies the state of our planetary health. It's burdened by transportation and industrial pollution. It is the part of the Boston Harbor where ships bring jet fuel to be stored for the nearby airport. It's also an embodiment of the pressing problems of human health in cities. It is dense, overcrowded, very expensive housing for many immigrant families, and it became the epicenter of COVID-19 infections in Massachusetts and related food insecurity that added to ongoing epidemics of asthma, diabetes, heart disease in these communities. And this, of course, results from decades of discriminatory planning and development policies. This flawed map of Boston shows, this is on the right, how Chelsea and East Boston are disproportionately impacted in the region. And on the left, you see how Chelsea is also the epicenter of social vulnerability. Most of its territory combines multiple factors of what we call environmental justice communities. Now, these very local dynamics are not unique to Chelsea. In fact, they tell the story of climate change globally. That is the story of urban migrant communities, where, as I mentioned in the UN report I showed you before, are going to feel the disproportionate impact of climate change. And indeed, Chelsea is choked by transportation-related sources of pollution converging around this marine industrial port. Interstate highways, industrial arteries, the airport are all right there. And this is compounded by an overbuilt environment with high imperviousness and little open space, which exacerbates the risk from climate change, which in this area are sea level rise, storm surge, and extreme heat. And when you look even closer in Chelsea, you see a microspatial inequity problem, that from one block to another, from one street to another, the environmental quality differs greatly, placing disproportionate burdens on smaller numbers of people that did not create the problem to begin with. And so we started looking at the development project that is about to transform this industrial site in the waterfront, not by displacing industry, but by building a better relationship between industry and its residential neighborhoods. They have great plans for green infrastructure, green buffers, etc. And so we are going to be measuring the impacts of that work with sensor networks before and after. What we're trying to solve is a challenge for architectural practice, that when climate resilience is both global and local, but the data and the site analysis does not yet reflect this. Buildings shape those microspatial inequities, but we don't have the methods to measure and mitigate the impacts. The design process needs to be conscious of these inequities, but the sensors that could be a good solution for measuring and understanding that are underutilized in design. And dynamic data is very powerful, but it's only powerful if it's interpreted to guide better community decisions. So we're building a pilot. It's a demonstration, and it's to prove that it's a good process so that every municipality mandates this equity-driven process as part of the environmental assessment and community engagement of development projects. It's building on the renewed urgency caused by the pandemic in this part of the city, and it's building on a particular part of the city that's seeing dramatic transformation. We're also building on the activism of this community. We're working with a community organization. We're building a relationship with them to understand what are their priorities, what they care about, what they're fighting for, and how can visualizing environmental data help them be better advocates and co-designers in this process. Now, Chelsea is being very proactive at understanding the interaction between infrastructure decisions and consequences. They started a project putting air quality sensors, and this project that we're starting now will use air quality sensors in addition to flooding sensors and temperature to measure different types of hazards. We're building on the urban research policy infrastructure to make that data available for the community so that they can understand the information and make sense of it with us. And we're using participatory modeling tools, forms of knowledge co-construction and engagement to help people make decisions and participate in the design process with us to understand how to invest in green infrastructure, where to do it, what types, and with what purpose. Now, the goal is to develop a transformative model of practice in which architects are envisioned as co-learners and co-designers with the community. So using sensor networks to identify the microspatial inequities, understanding how green infrastructure mitigates those microspatial inequities by actually measuring real projects, and using participatory modeling to essentially understand and make sense of that data and empower the community to invest in its own transformation. And the goal is that together, these things will create a science and community-driven process for more equitable development. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.